A veteran and his dog sheltered an old man. What he inherited shocked everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a cold, dreary winter evening when Charles, a battle-hardened veteran, and his faithful German shepherd, Max, trudged along the snow-covered roads of a small town in northern Michigan. Charles had spent years in service, first in the army and then wandering from one odd job to another, never finding peace. His dog, Max, had been his only constant companion. Max had seen Charles through the darkest of times, from the scorching deserts overseas to the bitter cold of abandoned streets. That night, as the snowflakes fell heavier, they stumbled upon something unexpected. As they walked past an old, creaky house on the edge of town, Charles noticed a faint figure by the front porch, struggling against the harsh winds. An elderly man, bent with age, was standing there, seemingly lost. His frail body was almost buried beneath the thick layer of snow, his face pale and frozen. Without hesitation, Charles and Max rushed to his side. The man, barely able to speak, seemed confused and frightened. Charles, with his military training, quickly assessed the situation. He lifted the man into his arms and, with Max leading the way, guided them both inside the small house. The old man, who introduced himself as Harold, was barely able to get his words out. His voice trembled with the weight of years of solitude and hardship. As Charles settled him near the fireplace, Harold whispered a few words of gratitude, mentioning how he had no family, no one to take care of him, and how this winter had been particularly harsh. Charles, though struggling with his own demons, found his heart opening to the man. The warmth from the fire seemed to melt more than just the snow outside. It melted something in Charles, too. He couldn't ignore the aching loneliness that had plagued Harold for so long. For the first time in a while, Charles felt like he had found a purpose again. Over the next few days, Charles and Max kept a close eye on Harold. They brought him food and ensured he stayed warm. Despite the chilly weather, Charles found himself spending more time with Harold, hearing stories of a life filled with lost chances, missed opportunities, and a deep regret about the family he once had but lost to time. One afternoon, as they sat around the fireplace, Harold revealed a startling truth. He wasn't just any old man, living in isolation. He had been part of a once thriving family, a family that had owned a large estate outside the town for generations. But after a series of tragic events, Harold had cut himself off from the world, choosing to live in quiet obscurity. As the days turned into weeks, Charles and Max continued to care for Harold, and slowly, a bond formed between them. But little did Charles know, this seemingly simple act of kindness was about to change his life in a way he could never have imagined. One day, as Charles was helping Harold organize some old papers in the attic, they uncovered something hidden beneath a pile of dusty books, a letter, sealed with an old wax emblem. The letter, addressed to Harold, was a legal document. It revealed that Harold was the sole heir to the family estate and all the wealth that had been abandoned for decades. Charles's heart raced as he read the words aloud. What Harold had inherited was far beyond the value of money. It was a treasure trove of family history, land, and buildings, an inheritance that would change everything. The letter also included instructions for Harold to pass on the estate to someone deserving. Harold, now frail and unsure of his own worth, looked at Charles with gratitude in his eyes. "I've lived in solitude for so long," Harold said softly. "I never thought I would find someone who could help me fulfill my family's legacy." Charles, though overwhelmed by the discovery, felt the weight of the moment. This was no longer just about the old man. This was about a new beginning for him, too. As the snow continued to fall outside, Charles and Max stood at the threshold of a life they never expected to lead, with an inheritance that would leave everyone in town shocked. As the days passed, Charles found himself in a strange new world. The letter they had discovered in Harold's attic revealed not just an inheritance, but an entire legacy. The family estate, long abandoned, was worth more than any treasure he could have imagined. It was a sprawling property nestled at the foot of the mountains, with acres of land that had been untouched for decades. Charles couldn't quite grasp the weight of what he had read, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about money. It was about history, about a past that had been lost, and now it was in his hands. Harold, frail as he was, didn't seem to understand the full magnitude of the inheritance either. He had lived a quiet, humble life, far removed from the grandeur of the past. His eyes had always been on the present, and now, with his health failing, the idea of managing a vast estate seemed almost impossible to him. But Charles, despite his own struggles, felt a deep sense of duty. He couldn't ignore the fact that this inheritance was more than just a financial windfall. It was a chance for him to build something, to give something back to the world. After all, he had always been a man of action, someone who couldn't sit idle when there was work to be done. He knew that Harold, though grateful, couldn't carry this burden alone. And so, Charles decided to take matters into his own hands. Together, he and Max set out to visit the estate. It was a long drive, the kind of journey that allowed Charles to clear his mind, to think about the path ahead. Max, as always, sat by his side, sensing the change in his master's demeanor. The road was winding, cutting through forests of tall pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. As they neared the estate, Charles couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The property sat atop a hill, overlooking a serene valley below. The grand mansion that once stood proud had weathered the passage of time, its stone walls cracked, the windows clouded with years of neglect. Yet, there was something undeniable about the place. It held a certain power, a history that whispered in the wind. They parked at the gate, which stood as a silent sentinel to the forgotten past. Charles stepped out, feeling the chill of the mountain air bite at his skin. Max, ever the loyal companion, bounded ahead, his tail wagging. The gates creaked open, and as they stepped onto the grounds, the feeling of stepping into another world enveloped them. The mansion, though aged and worn, had an undeniable charm. The ivy that had overtaken much of the exterior gave it an air of mystery, as if the house itself was waiting to reveal its secrets. Charles walked slowly up the steps, his boots crunching against the gravel path. His heart beat a little faster with each step, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous was about to unfold. As he reached the front door, he paused for a moment, looking up at the towering structure. The door, old and weathered, seemed to beckon him in. With a deep breath, he pushed it open. The interior was even more remarkable than he had imagined. The grand staircase stood at the center of the foyer, its once polished banisters now dulled by time. The walls were adorned with portraits of the family who had once called this place home, their eyes watching him as he moved deeper into the house. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and the silence was almost palpable, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. As Charles explored, he found rooms filled with antique furniture, some of which seemed to be in surprisingly good condition. But it wasn't the furniture or the walls that caught his attention. It was the hidden door behind a bookshelf, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. His heart skipped a beat as he reached for the handle. The door creaked open to reveal a hidden room, one that had clearly been untouched for decades. Inside, the room was filled with more than just relics of the past. There were books, papers, and photographs, but there was also something far more valuable, an old family journal. The journal, its leather cover cracked and worn, held the key to the estate's most precious secret. As Charles flipped through the pages, he realized that this estate wasn't just a piece of land. It was the heart of a legacy that had been lost to time. The journal chronicled the family's rise and fall, their triumphs and tragedies, and most importantly, it contained a map that led to something even more valuable than the estate itself. But what Charles hadn't expected was the strange sensation that washed over him as he read the journal. It wasn't just about the estate or the wealth. It was about the family's soul, the spirit that had once thrived here. And in that moment, Charles realized that the inheritance was never meant to be just about money. It was meant to be a way for him to reconnect with something much deeper, his own sense of purpose. As the days turned into weeks, Charles began to piece together the family's history, uncovering secrets and untold stories that gave him a new understanding of the world he now found himself in. With the help of Max, he began to breathe new life into the estate, restoring it to its former glory. But more than anything, he felt the weight of the legacy he had inherited. It wasn't just the house, the land, or the wealth. It was the responsibility to carry on the family's story, to ensure that it would never be forgotten again. As weeks went by, Charles settled into his new life at the estate, though he often found himself feeling overwhelmed. The weight of his newfound responsibilities, both for the property and the legacy it represented, seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. But amidst the challenges, one thing became clear. He had found a place where he finally belonged. The days were long, filled with endless work. Charles spent hours every day restoring the mansion, fixing its creaking floors, peeling paint, and broken windows. Max was always by his side, exploring the grounds, alert to any movement, as if the dog too understood the significance of this place. Yet, despite all the labor, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. One evening, after a long day of work, Charles sat on the front porch, staring out at the estate. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the property. It was a beautiful sight, but it felt hollow without someone to share it with. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a sudden rustle behind him interrupted his reverie. Max, ever watchful, barked excitedly and ran to the edge of the porch. Charles turned just in time to see an elderly woman approaching. She was bundled in a thick coat, her hair hidden beneath a scarf. Her gait was slow but purposeful, and there was a strength in the way she moved, despite her age. Charles stood up, a little startled. The woman smiled warmly as she approached. "I was wondering if you were still here," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm Margaret, Harold's sister." The name caught Charles off guard. He had never heard Harold mention a sister. Margaret noticed his confusion and explained, "I've been living a few miles away. Harold and I lost touch after the family tragedy. I came to check on him, but when I heard he was no longer here, I thought I'd come to see what's become of this old place." Charles welcomed her inside, offering tea and a place by the fire. As they sat in the parlor, the conversation turned to the past. Margaret spoke of the family's glory days, of how the estate had been a symbol of their prosperity. But she also spoke of the tragedy that had followed, the deaths of Harold's parents in a car accident, the decline of the family's wealth, and Harold's decision to retreat from the world. "Harold always believed that the house would come back to life one day," Margaret said, her eyes distant as if she were reliving those memories. "He was the last one left, and he never wanted to part with it. But I never thought I'd see it like this again." Charles listened intently, feeling a deeper connection to the estate and its history with each passing moment. Margaret's words made him realize that his decision to restore the mansion wasn't just for Harold. It was for the entire family, for the memory of everything that had been lost. As the evening wore on, Charles and Margaret walked through the house, reminiscing about the past. When they reached the library, Margaret stopped in front of a large portrait of a man Charles hadn't seen before. "That's my father," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "He was the one who built this place into something magnificent." Charles could see the pride in her eyes as she spoke of her father, and he realized that this house held more than just bricks and wood. It held the dreams and hopes of an entire family. After Margaret left later that night, Charles sat in the library, staring at the portrait of the man who had helped build the legacy he now held in his hands. It was in that quiet moment, with Max lying at his feet, that Charles understood his purpose. He wasn't just restoring a house or a piece of land. He was honoring a legacy, a family, and a history that deserved to be remembered. The next morning, as Charles was walking through the estate, he came across something that made his heart skip a beat. A small, old wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards in the library. His hands trembled as he pried it open. Inside, he found a collection of documents, photographs, and letters, some of them dating back to the early days of the estate. But it wasn't the papers that caught his attention. At the bottom of the box was a key, an ornate key, unlike anything he had seen before. The key was engraved with intricate designs, and there was a small inscription on the side, "To the heart of the estate." Charles's heart raced as he turned the key over in his hands. What could it unlock? The key seemed to hold the answer to a question he hadn't even thought to ask. He felt a surge of excitement, but also a sense of unease. There was something more to this estate, something hidden, something that had yet to be revealed. The discovery felt like a sign, There was still more to uncover, more to understand, and Charles was determined to find out what lay behind that mysterious key. As Charles stood there, holding the ornate key in his hand, he couldn't help but feel a surge of both excitement and trepidation. What could it possibly unlock? His heart raced as he turned the key over, admiring the intricate designs etched into its surface. It was clear this was no ordinary key. It felt heavy in his palm, almost as if it carried the weight of centuries of history, waiting to be discovered. He tucked it into his pocket, deciding to wait until the next day to explore further. But that night, as he sat alone in the library, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that the estate held more secrets than he could ever have imagined. Max lay quietly beside him, his amber eyes flicking toward the shadows in the corner of the room. The dog had become more than just a companion. He was a guardian, sensing things that Charles could not. After a few moments of quiet contemplation, Charles stood up and walked over to the large portrait of Harold's father, which hung in the center of the room. His fingers brushed the frame lightly as he wondered what had been lost over the years. What had been left behind when the family's fortune faded into memory? What was the true legacy of this place? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the house itself was a character in this story. It wasn't just a building. It was a witness to everything that had transpired here, a keeper of memories, both beautiful and tragic. Charles knew that if he was to truly understand his inheritance, he would have to delve deeper into its past. The next morning, Charles rose early, determined to explore the mystery the key held. He grabbed Max's leash and headed to the back of the mansion, where the estate's grounds seemed to stretch endlessly. As they walked through the overgrown garden, Max stopped suddenly, his nose twitching. The dog's instincts had always been sharp, but today, there was a different energy in the air, something unspoken. Charles paused, feeling the same unease settle in his chest. The key, the journal, the hidden room, all these discoveries seemed to point towards something larger than just an old family heirloom. There had to be more to this. They reached the far end of the garden, where an old stone path led to a weathered door built into the side of a cliff. It was a part of the mansion Charles had never noticed before. The door seemed out of place, as though it had been intentionally hidden from view. The stone was cracked and worn, but the key in his pocket seemed to call out to him. With a deep breath, he pulled the key from his coat and slid it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and with a groan, the door opened. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the room beyond was bathed in a dim light that filtered through cracks in the stone. It was a small chamber, but its contents were staggering. On one wall, there were shelves lined with old maps, some of which were faded and yellowed with age. The opposite wall held a large, ornate mirror, its frame covered in intricate carvings. But it was the center of the room that caught Charles's attention. At the heart of the chamber stood a large wooden chest, its surface carved with symbols that matched the ones on the key. As Charles approached the chest, he felt a sense of reverence. This was it. This was what he had been searching for. With trembling hands, he opened the chest. Inside, he found a collection of objects, each one more valuable than the last, a set of rare gemstones, ancient coins, and a stack of documents sealed with wax. But it wasn't the treasure that held his attention. It was the letter, written in the same handwriting as the one he had found in the attic. As he unfolded the letter, his eyes widened. The contents were startling. The letter was addressed to Harold's ancestors, detailing the true origin of the estate. It spoke of a secret lineage, a family entrusted with a sacred duty, one that had been passed down through generations. The estate, the wealth, and the property were not just material things. They were the key to something far greater. As Charles read on, he learned that the family had once been protectors of a hidden power, something that could change the course of history. But that power had been lost over time, buried beneath layers of secrecy and betrayal. The letter concluded with a warning. The power could only be unlocked by someone pure of heart, someone who had the courage to carry on the family's mission. Charles felt his pulse quicken. This was it. This was the reason he had been chosen to inherit the estate. It wasn't just about restoring the mansion or preserving a family legacy. It was about something much bigger, a mission that would shape his future and possibly the world's. He stood there, in that dimly lit room, the weight of the letter heavy in his hands. The key, the chest, the family history, all of it had led to this moment. But what did it mean for him? What was his role in this great unfolding story? As the door to the hidden chamber creaked behind him, Charles knew that his life had just taken a turn into the unknown. And with Max by his side, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The days following Charles's discovery in the hidden chamber passed in a blur. The weight of the letter and the chest's contents lingered heavily on his mind. Max, always by his side, seemed to sense the change in the air. Charles had never imagined that inheriting this mansion would lead to such profound revelations. Yet now it felt as though his entire life had led him to this moment. With the knowledge he had uncovered, there was no turning back. The mansion, the estate, and everything it represented had become more than just a property. It was now a key to something far larger than he had ever expected. That night, as he sat in the library, studying the letter once again, he noticed something he had missed before. It was a small, nearly imperceptible detail, a reference to a hidden location, marked only as the heart of the estate. Charles's pulse quickened. The key, the chest, and the family's history were all part of a greater puzzle, one that was slowly coming into focus. He could no longer wait. He had to find this place, this heart of the estate. The next morning, Charles set out with Max to search for it. He revisited every corner of the mansion, scouring the grounds, looking for any sign that might lead him to the secret location mentioned in the letter. The mansion itself seemed to watch him, its old stone walls standing firm, as if waiting for him to uncover the secrets they held. Max led the way, his keen senses guiding them through rooms Charles had already searched countless times. As they moved deeper into the estate, Charles felt a strange pull, as if the house itself was guiding him towards something he couldn't yet comprehend. Finally, after hours of searching, they reached a secluded area at the back of the estate, near a dense forest that had grown wild over the years. In the center of the woods stood a large, ancient oak tree, its branches stretching high into the sky. At the base of the tree, hidden beneath a blanket of leaves and moss, was a stone slab, weathered by time. Charles crouched down, brushing away the debris, and noticed an inscription carved into the stone. To the heart, to the soul, to the legacy. His heart raced as he realized what this meant. The heart of the estate wasn't just a metaphor. It was a literal place, hidden away for generations. With trembling hands, he pushed the stone slab aside. It moved easily, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. The air grew colder as he descended, and Max's low growl echoed through the narrow passageway. The staircase seemed endless, winding deep beneath the estate, as if it were taking them further into the heart of the family's past. At the bottom of the stairs, Charles found himself in a vast underground chamber, illuminated only by the faint glow of his lantern. The room was filled with shelves, each one lined with old books and artifacts, but what caught his attention was the massive stone altar in the center of the room. On top of the altar was an ornate box, similar to the chest he had found earlier, but this one was different. It was intricately carved with symbols he had seen before, but they were far older, more elaborate. As he approached the altar, Charles could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The box seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't explain. He reached out and opened it slowly. Inside, he found a set of ancient scrolls, each one carefully wrapped and sealed. But it wasn't the scrolls that held his attention. It was the object resting on top of them, a small, gold key, identical to the one he had discovered earlier. Charles's breath caught in his throat as he realized the significance. This was it. The key he had found was meant to open this very box, and now that he had uncovered its contents, everything was falling into place. The scrolls contained the true history of the estate, its origins, its purpose, and the family's role in protecting the sacred knowledge hidden beneath their home. But there was more. As Charles read through the scrolls, he learned that the family had been entrusted with guarding an ancient secret, a power that had been passed down through generations. The secret was not just about wealth or influence. It was about the preservation of something far greater, something that could change the course of history itself. The letter, the key, the chest, and now the scrolls. They were all pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for him to solve. And now that he had uncovered the truth, Charles knew that his journey was far from over. The legacy he had inherited was not just a house or land. It was a mission, a responsibility to protect the secret and ensure that it was never lost again. As he closed the box and placed it back on the altar, Charles felt a new sense of purpose settle in his chest. Max, ever watchful, sat beside him, as if acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Together, they had uncovered the heart of the estate, and now, with this newfound knowledge, they would face whatever came next. The discovery of the hidden chamber beneath the estate had set a new course for Charles's life, and now, with the ancient scrolls in his possession, the responsibility, he felt, grew even heavier. The weight of the family's legacy pressed on him, and as he sat in the quiet library, surrounded by the knowledge of the past, he could sense the enormity of what was ahead. The scrolls were not just old texts. They were the key to understanding a power that had been guarded for generations. Charles's heart raced with the realization that this was not simply about protecting an estate or its wealth. The secret the family had safeguarded was far greater, and it was now in his hands. Max, his faithful German shepherd, lay quietly at his feet, sensing his master's unease. Charles rubbed the dog's ears absent-mindedly, grateful for the silent companionship. Max had been with him through everything, the battles, the lonely nights, and now this monumental discovery. For a moment, Charles allowed himself to feel the weight of the moment. He had uncovered a hidden world, one that had been lost to time, and now, it was his job to protect it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't have all the answers. The scrolls contained clues, but they were cryptic, and the full meaning behind the family's ancient role remained unclear. The heart of the estate had been revealed, but what exactly was it that needed protection? What had the family been guarding for so long? The more he pondered these questions, the more unsettled he became. There was no turning back now, and deep down, he knew that the answers wouldn't come easily. Over the next few days, Charles spent long hours studying the scrolls, cross-referencing the ancient texts with the journal he had found earlier. He searched the estate for any other clues that might shed light on the family's purpose. But no matter how hard he looked, he found nothing more. As he sifted through the documents once again, something caught his eye, an old, worn map, tucked into the back of the scrolls. It wasn't like the others. This map was marked with a series of symbols, many of which Charles had seen before. At the top of the map was a symbol he hadn't yet recognized, a spiral with a dot at its center. Below it, the words "the key to the past" were inscribed in faded ink. Charles's heart skipped a beat. The map was a guide, but a guide to what? He stared at the spiral, feeling its significance pulse through him. There was no doubt now. This was the final clue. The spiral, the key, the map. All of it led to something deeper, something hidden beneath the estate. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to go back to the heart of the estate. The next morning, Charles set out, the map in hand and Max by his side. The estate was quiet as usual, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching against the frozen ground. The air was crisp, and the sky above was a deep shade of blue, the kind of winter morning that seemed to promise something great was about to happen. They reached the ancient oak tree once again. This time, Charles felt a sense of certainty. The symbol on the map matched the spiral he had seen on the stone slab beneath the tree. With a steady breath, he knelt down and traced his fingers over the stone. The spiral, etched into the rock, seemed to glow faintly under his touch. He knew what he had to do. With a quiet whisper, Charles spoke the words he had read in the scrolls, the ancient language that had been passed down through the family for centuries. As he spoke the final word, the ground beneath him trembled, and the earth shifted. The stone slab moved once again, this time revealing a hidden compartment beneath the oak's roots. The compartment was small but deep, and inside, Charles found something that took his breath away, a key, identical to the one he had discovered in the altar room. But this key was different. It was older, worn, and covered in markings that seemed to pulse with energy. Charles felt a rush of realization. This was the key to unlocking the true power of the estate. The estate had never been just about land or wealth. It had always been about guarding this key. The secret it held was far more valuable than any treasure. As he reached for the key, the ground beneath him shifted once more, and a hidden doorway appeared, carved into the roots of the tree. The door was ancient, but the key fit perfectly into the lock. As the door opened, Charles felt a surge of energy, a force that seemed to radiate from the very earth itself. The door led to a hidden chamber, and in the center of it stood an object that glowed with a soft, ethereal light. A crystal, pulsing with a power that was both ancient and eternal. Charles approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the heart of the estate, the true legacy, the power that had been passed down through generations. He reached out and touched the crystal, and in that moment, everything changed. He felt a rush of knowledge, a flood of memories and visions from the past. The family's mission, the secret they had guarded, all of it was now clear. The estate was not just a place of power, it was the key to protecting a force that could shape the world. Charles understood now that his purpose was not just to restore the estate, but to protect this power, to ensure it was never used for harm. As he stood in the hidden chamber, with Max by his side, Charles knew his life had been forever changed. He had found the heart of the estate, and with it, he had found his true calling. The legacy of the family was now his to carry, and with it came a responsibility greater than he had ever imagined. The days following Charles's discovery in the hidden chamber beneath the estate were filled with a new sense of purpose and urgency. The power that lay beneath the family's mansion was greater than anything he had ever imagined. The crystal he had found was not just a relic of the past. It was a beacon of energy, a force that had the potential to change everything. As Charles sat in the library, the scrolls, the key, and the crystal all spread out before him, he realized that his role in this legacy was far more important than simply restoring the house or preserving the family's wealth. This was about guarding something far more precious, something that had been hidden for centuries, and now it was his to protect. Max, ever the loyal companion, lay at his feet, sensing the shift in his master's emotions. Charles's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on him, but at the same time, there was a growing sense of resolve. He had always believed that his time as a soldier had prepared him for difficult decisions. But this was unlike anything he had ever faced. The power in the crystal was real, and it could not fall into the wrong hands. He knew that he had to find a way to protect it, to ensure that it was never misused. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly understood. The scrolls had been cryptic, the family's history shrouded in mystery, and the true purpose of the estate was still unclear. The power was something ancient, something that had been passed down through generations, but what was its true purpose? And how was he supposed to keep it safe? There was only one person left who might know more, Margaret. She had known the family for years, and though she had only recently reappeared, Charles felt that her knowledge of the estate's past was crucial. He decided to visit her again. The journey to her home was long, and as Charles drove through the winding roads of northern Michigan, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the very air around him had shifted, growing thicker with tension. Max, who had been unusually quiet, sat up in the truck, his eyes alert. When they reached Margaret's house, Charles was greeted with a warmth that felt reassuring, but there was an unease in Margaret's eyes as she invited him in. "I've been expecting you," she said softly, her gaze lingering on Max. "You found it, haven't you?" Charles nodded. "The crystal," he said. "The power beneath the estate. I know now that it's more than just a family treasure. It's a force that needs to be protected." Margaret's expression grew solemn, and she motioned for Charles to sit. She took a deep breath, as if weighing her words carefully. "What you found is ancient," she said. "The power that lies beneath the estate has been passed down through generations, guarded by our family. But it's not just a treasure. It's something far greater. It has the potential to heal or destroy." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "What do you mean?" Charles asked, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "The family was tasked with guarding the crystal," Margaret continued, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not just a symbol of wealth. It's a force that connects the earth to something much larger. It was meant to keep the balance, to prevent a great darkness from spreading." Charles listened intently, his mind racing. He had always believed the estate was just a place of history, but now he understood that it was far more than that. It was a battleground for something ancient, something beyond his comprehension. "How do we protect it?" he asked. "I don't know if it can be protected," Margaret whispered. "The crystal has been kept safe for centuries, but there are others who seek it. People who would use its power for their own gain. And they know you found it." Charles's heart sank. The idea of someone else discovering the crystal, of it falling into the wrong hands, was terrifying. "What do we do now?" he asked. Margaret stood up and walked over to a cabinet, retrieving a small wooden box. "This was my father's," she said, opening it to reveal a series of small, intricate charms. "These charms are part of the family's protection. They were passed down to each generation to safeguard the crystal. You must wear one, Charles. They will help protect you." Charles took one of the charms, feeling its weight in his hand. It was small, no larger than a coin, but it was warm to the touch, as if it contained a pulse of energy. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. As he left Margaret's house, the weight of her words stayed with him. The power of the crystal was not just a treasure, it was a responsibility, a burden that he had to bear. And now, with the charm around his neck, he felt the pull of the estate once more. The balance had to be maintained, and he was the one chosen to do it. But the road ahead was uncertain. He could feel the danger closing in, and he knew that the fight to protect the crystal was just beginning. As he drove back to the estate, the darkening sky reflected the turmoil he felt inside. Max, sensing his unease, rested his head on Charles's lap, offering silent comfort. Charles looked ahead at the mansion in the distance. It was no longer just a house. It was a fortress, and he was its protector. The power beneath it would not fall easily into the wrong hands. Not if he could help it. The days following his conversation with Margaret weighed heavily on Charles. The reality of what lay ahead was becoming clearer, but the road seemed more dangerous with each passing moment. The crystal, now locked safely in his study, pulsed with a quiet energy, almost as if it were alive. But it was not just the crystal that concerned him. The dangers he'd been warned about were real. The thought of others who sought its power made his pulse race. There was no doubt in his mind. There were forces out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The charm Margaret had given him hung around his neck, the small object a constant reminder of the responsibility he now carried. He had always been a man of action, but this felt different. The stakes were higher than anything he had ever encountered in his military career. He had to keep the crystal safe, but he didn't know how. He had no allies, no clear plan, and no one he could trust. All he had was his instinct and the protection of the charm. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of red and orange, Charles stood on the porch of the mansion, Max by his side. The air was cool, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Max's ears perked up, his nose twitching. The dog had always been more attuned to the environment than Charles. Max was uneasy, his body tense as he stood by Charles's side, watching the forest that surrounded the estate. The hairs on the back of Charles's neck stood up. Something was wrong. Before he could react, a low, distant rumble echoed through the trees. It was followed by another sound, footsteps, quick and deliberate. Charles's heart raced. He had been expecting this moment, but he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to the mansion. Charles turned to Max, who let out a low growl, his instincts on high alert. Charles stepped inside and grabbed his jacket, the weight of his own nerves making his hands shake slightly. As he stepped out into the yard, the sounds of the approaching footsteps grew clearer. He knew this was no accident. Someone was coming for him. Someone knew about the crystal. He scanned the woods, every shadow seeming to hide a potential threat. And then he saw them. Figures moving swiftly through the trees, dressed in dark clothing. They weren't here to make peace. Charles's mind raced. The family's legacy, the secret of the crystal, was no longer just a burden he had to protect. It had become a target. The figures moved closer, their intentions clear. Charles reached for the gun tucked in his waistband, but as his fingers brushed against the handle, he realized that this wasn't a battle he could fight with force alone. He had to outsmart them. He had to be clever. Max barked sharply, causing the figures to halt, their heads snapping in the direction of the sound. Charles's heart pounded as he made a decision. He couldn't let them get to the mansion. Not yet. Not until he figured out what they wanted. He motioned for Max to follow him, and the two of them moved silently through the underbrush, staying low to the ground. Charles's military training kicked in, and he used the terrain to his advantage, moving swiftly and quietly, keeping his distance from the intruders. The figures were closer now, their voices barely audible as they discussed their plans. "The mansion should be empty by now," one of them said. Get in, grab whatever you can, and get out. Charles's blood ran cold. They didn't know what they were looking for, but they were looking for something, and he couldn't let them find it. They reached the edge of the woods and paused, scanning the mansion. Charles crouched low, his mind working quickly. He knew the layout of the property, and he knew where the hidden chamber was. If he could lead them away from the mansion, away from the crystal, he might have a chance. He signaled to Max, who followed his every move with silent precision. Together, they moved toward the barn on the far side of the estate. The barn was an old structure, forgotten by most, and it would make the perfect decoy. Charles wasn't sure what the intruders wanted, but he had to keep them distracted long enough to figure out their next move. As they neared the barn, Charles spotted something that gave him a glimmer of hope, an old trapdoor hidden beneath the wooden floorboards. He had never opened it before, but he knew it led to a tunnel system that ran beneath the estate. If he could get there without being noticed, he could disappear into the tunnels and figure out a way to outsmart these intruders. He waited for the right moment, watching as the figures moved closer to the mansion. His heart was pounding in his chest. Max, ever the sentinel, stood by his side, his eyes fixed on the figures in the distance. Charles took a deep breath, then moved swiftly, pulling open the trapdoor and slipping into the darkness below. The cool air of the tunnel greeted him as he descended, the door closing silently behind him. In the darkness, Charles let his breath settle. He had a plan. He didn't know what the intruders were after, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let them get to the crystal. Charles moved silently through the dark tunnel, the faint echo of his footsteps swallowed by the cool, damp walls. Max trotted alongside him, his body low to the ground, ever alert. The tunnel was narrow, its air thick with the scent of earth and forgotten time. It had been years since anyone had used these passages, but Charles knew the layout well. This hidden network ran beneath the estate, connecting rooms and chambers that had been long sealed off. It was the family's secret, a safeguard against intruders, and now, Charles was relying on it to protect the one thing he could not allow to fall into the wrong hands, the crystal. He moved quickly, knowing the intruders were still somewhere above ground, searching for whatever they believed was hidden in the mansion. Their voices, faint through the stone, reached his ears every now and then, their footsteps growing more frantic as they searched. But Charles wasn't afraid. The tunnels had always been his escape, his refuge, and today they would serve as his fortress. He had a plan, but it was risky. He needed to draw the intruders away from the mansion, away from the crystal, long enough for him to act. He had no idea what they were really after, but he knew they would stop at nothing to get it. As he reached the far end of the tunnel, he paused, pressing his ear against the stone wall. The voices above were louder now, closer. They were heading toward the barn, just as he had hoped. He had set up a distraction, a decoy to keep them occupied while he made his move. With a steady hand, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the small gold key. He had found it in the secret chamber beneath the oak tree, and now it felt heavier in his hand than ever before. He had no idea what it unlocked, but he knew it was tied to the power he was trying to protect. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the end of the tunnel. There, hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy, was a door, another secret entryway into the heart of the estate. This was it. He had to move fast. He inserted the key into the lock, turning it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that led upward, back into the mansion. As he stepped out of the tunnel and onto the cold, stone floor, Charles paused, listening carefully. The voices above were still coming from the barn. They hadn't reached the mansion yet. He took a deep breath and moved quickly, his boots echoing softly against the stone. He knew the mansion's layout like the back of his hand. He had lived here long enough to understand its every creak and groan. And now, it was time to use that knowledge to his advantage. He headed toward the library, where the crystal was hidden. The room was dark, but Charles had memorized its contents. He knew exactly where the crystal was kept, locked away in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. As he reached for the floorboard, his mind raced. What would happen if the intruders found the crystal? What would they do with its power? He had no answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let them get their hands on it. With a quiet thud, the floorboard lifted, revealing the compartment. Charles's fingers closed around the crystal, its surface smooth and cold to the touch. For a moment, He simply held it, feeling its energy pulsing in his hand. It was as if the crystal itself knew what was at stake. He quickly covered the compartment again and stood, listening. The voices were growing closer. They were nearing the mansion. With the crystal in his hand, Charles knew he had to act fast. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was a fortress, a place where secrets were kept and power was protected. And now, it was his responsibility to ensure that the secrets of the estate would never be revealed to those who would misuse them. He turned toward the window, gazing out at the sprawling estate. The landscape stretched before him, quiet and still, but he knew danger was close. The intruders were just a few steps away from discovering everything. The crystal was only part of the puzzle. There was something more, something that needed to be guarded, something that had been hidden for centuries. Charles knew that it wasn't just about protecting the estate. It was about protecting the very essence of what it stood for. The legacy of the family, the power of the crystal, the knowledge contained in the ancient scrolls. It all had to be kept safe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Charles made a decision. He couldn't just hide. He couldn't keep running. It was time to confront the intruders. But he wouldn't do it alone. Max, his loyal dog, was more than just a companion. He was a guardian. Together, they would face whatever came next. And together, they would protect the legacy of the estate. With the crystal in his hand and Max by his side, Charles walked toward the door. The battle was just beginning, and he was ready to do whatever it took to ensure that the power beneath the estate remained hidden, safe, and protected. Charles's heart pounded in his chest as he moved swiftly through the mansion, the crystal still clenched tightly in his hand. Max stayed close, his senses alert, his low growl a constant reminder of the danger that loomed just outside. The intruders were getting closer, their footsteps now almost at the doorstep, their voices low but filled with urgency. They were determined to find what they had come for, and Charles knew they wouldn't stop until they did. He had to act quickly. The mansion, once a place of history and family pride, had become a battleground. Every shadow, every creaking floorboard felt like an impending threat. Charles had already made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer to confront the intruders. He had to protect the crystal, but he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. The power inside the crystal was immense, and it could not fall into the wrong hands. As he approached the main hall, he hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had been preparing for this moment, but he was still unsure of how the confrontation would unfold. Max, sensing his uncertainty, nudged him gently, as if to reassure him. They had been through so much together, and Charles knew that, with Max by his side, they could face whatever came next. The sound of footsteps grew louder. The intruders had reached the front door. Charles quickly moved to the side, finding a hidden alcove where he could observe without being seen. He held his breath as the door creaked open, and two figures stepped inside, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Charles's pulse quickened as they moved through the entrance hall, their eyes scanning every corner. They didn't seem to know exactly where the crystal was hidden, but they were looking for something, and they would stop at nothing to find it. "Check the study," one of them muttered. "It's the last place they'll expect us to search." Charles's mind raced. The study was where the crystal had been hidden, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to simply hide it. He had to protect it, keep it safe. He couldn't let these strangers find it. As the figures began to move toward the study, Charles knew what he had to do. He waited for the right moment, then made his move. With the crystal in hand, he stepped out from the alcove and rushed toward the intruders. Max followed, his low growl reverberating through the hall, alerting the intruders to their presence. The two figures turned quickly, their eyes widening in surprise. "You found it," one of them sneered, reaching for the weapon hidden beneath their cloak. Charles's heart raced, but his focus remained sharp. He had prepared for this moment. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, they would take the crystal from him. "Not so fast," Charles said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. He held the crystal up, as if to show its power, knowing that its mere presence would be enough to stop them in their tracks. The two figures hesitated, their eyes fixed on the glowing object in Charles's hand. For a brief moment, the tension in the room was palpable. Then, one of the figures spoke. "You don't know what you have," they said, their voice low and dangerous. "That crystal doesn't belong to you. It belongs to us." Charles's grip tightened around the crystal. "I don't know who you are, "Or what you want with this," he replied. "But I won't let you have it." The intruders stepped forward, their intentions clear. They were determined to take the crystal by force if necessary. But Charles was ready. With Max by his side, he wasn't about to let anyone take what he had sworn to protect. He stepped back, positioning himself between the intruders and the crystal. The tension in the room grew as both sides prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Charles's mind raced, weighing his options. The crystal's power was undeniable, but he couldn't afford to use it recklessly. The last thing he wanted was to unleash its full potential without understanding the consequences. "Leave now," Charles said, his voice growing firmer. "This is your only warning." The intruders laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "You're in no position to make demands," one of them sneered. But Charles knew better. He wasn't just a man defending a treasure. He was the keeper of something far more significant, and he would not let it fall into the wrong hands. As the figures closed in, Charles took a deep breath and made his move. With a swift motion, he hurled the crystal toward the center of the room. The light from the crystal flared brightly, filling the space with a blinding glow. The intruders recoiled, their hands shielding their eyes from the intense light. Charles didn't wait for them to recover. He seized the moment and lunged forward, knocking the nearest intruder to the ground. Max was right behind him, his jaws snapping as he pinned down the second figure. The intruder struggled, but Max's grip was unrelenting. "You won't win," the first intruder hissed, struggling to regain his footing. "This isn't over." Charles stood over him, breathing heavily. "It is over," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "Not today." He turned to Max, who had already subdued the second intruder. With the situation under control, Charles knew the battle was won, but the war was far from over. The crystal, now glowing softly in the center of the room, was safe for the moment. But as he looked down at the defeated intruders, Charles realized that the true danger was just beginning. The air was thick with tension as Charles stood over the defeated intruders, their bodies sprawled out on the floor of the mansion's hall. Max, ever vigilant, kept a watchful eye on them, his growl soft but persistent, as if reminding the intruders that they were not to move. The crystal, still glowing faintly in the center of the room, seemed to pulse in time with Charles's heartbeat. He knew that this battle was over, but the war was far from finished. These men had been after the crystal, but they were only the beginning. There were others who knew about its power, others who would come for it. He couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. As Charles's eyes scanned the room, he felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. The crystal had been a beacon, a call to those who sought its power. But who were they really? Why had they come for it? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered, as the weight of his responsibility grew heavier. He couldn't keep the crystal hidden forever. The estate, with its centuries of secrets, had always been a sanctuary, a place of history. But now, it had become the focal point of a dangerous game, a game where the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. Charles moved toward the two intruders, his eyes hard with determination. He needed answers. The first man, the one he had knocked to the ground, was beginning to stir. His eyes fluttered open, and he groaned as he tried to sit up, clearly disoriented from the fall. Charles stepped forward, standing over him. "Who sent you?" Charles demanded, his voice low but firm. The man glared up at him, his face contorted with defiance, but Charles saw the fear in his eyes. This man wasn't used to being bested. "You don't know what you're dealing with." The intruder spat. "The crystal doesn't belong to you." Charles knelt down, his eyes narrowing. "Who does it belong to then?" he asked, his patience wearing thin. The man didn't respond, his lips pressed into a tight line. Charles grabbed him by the collar and lifted him slightly, his grip firm. "Tell me, or I'll make sure you regret it." The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. "You'll be sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ones who are coming for it, they're not like us. They won't stop until they get what they want." Charles's grip tightened. "Who are they?" he pressed. The man hesitated for a moment, then let out a slow breath. "The syndicate," he muttered. "They've been searching for the crystal for years. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." The name struck Charles like a punch to the gut. The syndicate. He had heard whispers of such a group, shadowy figures who operated in the underworld, trafficking in rare artifacts, ancient relics, and forbidden knowledge. If they were after the crystal, it was more dangerous than he had thought. Charles stepped back, releasing the man, who slumped to the floor. He turned to Max, who was still alert, his eyes never leaving the intruders. The situation had just escalated. Charles knew the crystal was powerful, but he hadn't fully understood its value until now. The syndicate was no ordinary organization. They were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. He had to keep the crystal safe. He couldn't let them have it. But what could he do? He couldn't fight an entire organization on his own. As Charles stood there, deep in thought, the second intruder, the one Max had pinned, began to stir. He was still dazed, but slowly starting to recover. Charles moved toward him, his gaze unwavering. "Who else is coming?" Charles asked, his voice calm but dangerous. The man looked up, his face pale, his lips trembling. He knew Charles wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he needed to know. The intruder opened his mouth to speak, but before he could answer, a loud crash echoed through the mansion. Charles's heart skipped a beat. It was coming from the back of the estate. He could hear the sounds of footsteps, heavy, purposeful, moving closer. The syndicate had arrived. Charles's blood ran cold. He had hoped for more time, more opportunity to prepare, but it seemed the time for hiding was over. The war had begun. The intruders he had just dealt with were only pawns. The true danger was still ahead. Charles turned to Max, who was already by his side, his instincts sharp as ever. "We need to move," Charles muttered, his mind racing. Now, the crystal was still sitting in the middle of the room, its faint glow lighting up the otherwise dark space. But it wasn't just a beacon now. It was a target, and Charles wasn't about to let it fall into the wrong hands. The syndicate would come for it. They would try to take it from him, but he wouldn't let them. The legacy of the estate, the power of the crystal, was now his responsibility, and he would protect it with everything he had. The sound of footsteps grew louder, unmistakably drawing nearer to the mansion. Charles's pulse quickened as he turned toward the door, his eyes narrowing. Max, sensing the tension in the air, growled softly at his side, his ears erect and alert. The intruders had made their move. The syndicate, as the man had warned, was here, and they were not going to let up until they had what they wanted. Charles's hand tightened around the crystal. He had to keep it safe, but the question now was how. The mansion, once a place of family history, had transformed into a battleground, and it wasn't just a fight for treasure. It was a fight for survival. He couldn't stand here and wait for them to breach the door. His mind raced for a plan. He needed to get the crystal out of the house, far from the reach of these ruthless people. The tunnels beneath the estate were the only way out, but Charles knew they wouldn't be safe for long. They would come for him underground if they had to. There was no escape, not unless he outsmarted them. "Max," Charles whispered, his voice steady, "stay close." The dog's ears perked up as he trotted beside Charles, who began to move swiftly, his footsteps almost silent on the old wooden floors. He headed toward the back of the mansion, where he knew there was a hidden passage that led to the tunnels. He could hear the intruders. Now, their voices low but filled with urgency as they moved through the house. They were searching every room, every corner. They would be here soon. Charles's heart pounded, but he kept his focus. The old estate, with its sprawling grounds and hidden secrets, had always been a fortress. Now, more than ever, it needed to be. As he reached the hidden passage, he pushed aside the heavy bookshelf that blocked the entrance. The stone door behind it creaked open, revealing the dark, cool tunnel. The dim light of his lantern cast long shadows on the walls as he descended with Max by his side. The scent of earth and old wood filled the air. The tunnel seemed endless, winding beneath the estate in a series of narrow passageways, each one a potential escape route, each one a chance to outwit his pursuers. But Charles knew it wasn't just about running. He couldn't hide forever. He had to find a way to stop them, to protect the crystal. As he walked deeper into the tunnel, his mind raced with possibilities. The crystal was more than just a relic. It held a power, an ancient energy that had been guarded by his family for generations. He had learned that from the scrolls, the maps, and the cryptic messages passed down through the years. But what was the power for? Why had it been hidden? What was he supposed to do with it? The questions gnawed at him, but for now, there was only one answer: survival. He had to get out of here, but he couldn't leave without making sure the crystal was safe. The deeper they went, the darker the tunnel became. The faint glow from his lantern barely illuminated the path ahead. Max trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, as if searching for something, and Charles followed, trusting the dog's instincts. The tunnel turned sharply, and they arrived at a small chamber. The walls were lined with ancient shelves, but Charles didn't have time to examine the artifacts. He moved quickly, scanning the room for an exit. There was another passageway on the far side, just beyond the stone altar. Charles hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing against the surface of the altar. It felt warm, as though it were alive, connected to the same energy that pulsed through the crystal. But he couldn't waste time. He pushed forward, following the narrow corridor that led even deeper into the earth. The sounds of the intruders were now muffled, but Charles knew they were still close. They were relentless. He could feel the weight of the crystal in his hand, its energy seeping into his skin, filling him with both power and dread. As they neared the end of the tunnel, Charles heard something that made his blood run cold, a distant shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing behind him. They were here. They had found him. The escape route was almost within reach, but now, with the syndicate so close, Charles realized the truth. There was no easy way out. No escape that didn't come with a cost. The choice was clear. He couldn't keep running. He had to make a stand. He had the crystal. He had the power. And it was time to face whatever came next. Charles stopped in his tracks and turned toward Max, the dog's amber eyes watching him intently. "Stay close," Charles muttered. Together, they turned to face the approaching danger. The passageway ahead was dim, but the light from the crystal illuminated their way forward. With the weight of the past, the future, and the power of the estate's legacy pressing on him, Charles prepared for what was about to come. He couldn't let them have the crystal. Not today. Not ever. The air was thick with anticipation as Charles stood at the edge of the narrow passageway, the crystal still glowing softly in his hand. Max, his loyal companion, remained at his side, alert and ready, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The footsteps of the intruders grew closer, echoing down the tunnel, but Charles didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment, and he was not about to back down. He had the crystal, the key to a power that could change everything, and he would protect it with his life, if necessary. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned to face the dark tunnel ahead. He knew that the syndicate would stop at nothing to get their hands on it. They would kill for it, if they had to. But Charles couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. With a steady breath, he stepped forward, the faint light of the crystal casting long shadows against the walls. Max moved silently beside him, his body tense, every muscle coiled in readiness. Charles's eyes scanned the tunnel, looking for any sign of movement, any clue that the intruders were close. The walls seemed to close in around them, the passageway narrowing as they moved deeper into the estate. Time felt as if it were slowing down, the tension hanging thick in the air. He knew that the end was near. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The battle was coming, and he had to be ready. As they reached the end of the tunnel, Charles stopped, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness ahead. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps now, not just one set, but several, moving quickly, coming closer. They were here. The intruders had found their way into the tunnels. Charles's hand tightened around the crystal, its warmth and energy radiating through his fingers. He could feel its power, but he knew that it wasn't enough to defeat the syndicate. This would require more than just strength. It would require strategy, quick thinking, and the ability to outsmart his enemies. He had one advantage, and that was the element of surprise. The tunnel opened up ahead, leading into a larger chamber. Charles and Max crept forward, moving silently, staying close to the shadows. The crystal's light dimmed as they entered the chamber, and for a moment, Charles allowed himself a breath. This was where the real test would come. The syndicate was close, and they would not be merciful. But Charles had no intention of letting them win. He moved swiftly, placing the crystal in the center of the room, just as he had seen in the ancient texts. The crystal began to pulse with light, its energy filling the chamber, casting an ethereal glow across the stone walls. Charles stepped back, watching carefully, ready for whatever came next. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he knew that the crystal's power was his best chance at stopping the syndicate. As the light from the crystal grew brighter, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The ground beneath Charles's feet trembled, and for a moment, He thought the entire mansion would collapse. But the rumbling stopped, and in the silence that followed, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. The leader of the syndicate. He was tall, his face obscured by a dark mask, his eyes cold and calculating. He studied Charles for a moment before speaking, his voice low and steady. "You don't understand the power you're dealing with," the man said, his tone laced with contempt. "That crystal belongs to us. It always has." Charles's grip on the crystal tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew that words would not sway this man. The syndicate wasn't here to negotiate, they were here to take. And they would do whatever it took to get what they wanted. The leader of the syndicate stepped forward, his hand reaching out for the crystal. Charles's heart raced as he prepared himself for the inevitable. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. With a swift motion, he lunged forward, knocking the leader of the syndicate back. Max barked fiercely, charging at the other figures who had appeared from the shadows. The room erupted into chaos. Charles's mind raced as he fought to keep the crystal out of their hands. He moved with precision, using the environment to his advantage, dodging and striking when necessary. The syndicate was relentless, but Charles was faster, more determined. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them take the crystal. The fight seemed to last forever, but slowly, the intruders began to retreat. The leader, seeing his men falter, turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows. Charles stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, the crystal still glowing brightly before him. The fight was over. For now, the crystal's power had proven to be enough to protect him, but Charles knew this wasn't the end. The syndicate would be back. They would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And so, the fight would continue. But Charles wasn't afraid. He had the crystal, and with it, he had the power to protect the legacy of his family. The mansion, the crystal, and everything they stood for would remain safe. As he stood there, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, Charles realized something important. This wasn't just about protecting a piece of history. It was about something more. It was about honor, duty, and the responsibility that came with the power he held. And he would do whatever it took to ensure that the crystal and the legacy of his family was never lost again. In this gripping tale, a battle-worn veteran and his loyal dog find themselves in the midst of a dangerous battle for a powerful crystal hidden beneath a family estate. As the story unfolds, Charles, a former soldier, discovers that his inheritance is more than just a mansion. It's a legacy tied to a powerful force that has been guarded for generations. In a race against time, Charles must protect the crystal from a mysterious and dangerous group determined to steal it. As the stakes rise and the danger intensifies, the courage and resilience of the veteran are tested like never before. This adventure, filled with twists and turns, showcases the strength and determination of a veteran, illustrating the powerful connection between loyalty, duty, and the will to survive. Veteran stories like this are more than just tales of war. They are stories of redemption, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. Through the trials and challenges Charles faces, we see how veteran stories reflect not only the battles fought on the front lines, but also the personal battles that shape a hero's journey. The power of the crystal is just one part of this larger tale, but it represents the ultimate test of character and survival. As the story builds to a thrilling conclusion, it reminds us that veteran stories are about overcoming the odds, facing the unknown, and standing strong in the face of insurmountable challenges. These veteran stories are the backbone of the narrative, capturing the essence of honor and sacrifice. As Charles battles to protect the legacy of his family and the mysterious crystal, his story becomes one of courage, grit, and the unyielding spirit of a veteran.